The greatest miracle is rarely the moment someone stands again. It is the moment someone refuses to believe they were beyond saving. For 20 years, the people of Blackstone Kingdom had grown accustomed to one heartbreaking sight. Every morning, precisely as the castle bells echoed across the valley, Alpha King Ethan Walker would be carried to the grand balcony overlooking his kingdom. Not by choice, by necessity. Two royal guards carefully lifted the handcrafted oak wheelchair onto the marble platform, while servants quietly lowered their eyes, pretending not to notice. No one spoke during those moments. Not because they feared their king, because they mourned for him. 20 years earlier, Ethan had been the strongest alpha warrior the kingdom had ever known. His victories had united rival packs, protected distant villages, and secured peace where endless war had once ruled. Then came the Battle of Ash Hollow. He returned alive, but he never walked again. The finest royal healers had examined him. Master physicians traveled from distant kingdoms. Scholars filled entire shelves with theories. Every treatment ended the same way. Nothing changed. Eventually, hope itself became another illness the castle learned to avoid. The healers stopped promising miracles. The servants stopped asking questions. Even Ethan himself stopped looking toward the castle gates whenever another physician arrived. Instead, he ruled from his chair with quiet dignity, hiding his disappointment behind discipline no one dared challenge. Yet every evening, after the council meetings ended and the great hall emptied, he remained alone beside the tall western window overlooking the royal gardens. Not because the view was beautiful, because from there, he could still imagine what it had once felt like to walk among the trees. Few people knew that. Fewer still ever noticed. Far beyond the castle walls, life continued very differently. At a modest roadside tavern called the Silver Lantern, 24-year-old Hannah Brooks balanced 3 wooden trays across crowded tables while greeting every traveler with the same gentle smile. She was only a waitress. Nothing more. No noble family. No respected title. No formal education. After losing both parents during a harsh winter several years earlier, Hannah survived by working from sunrise until long after sunset. The tavern owner often apologized for the exhausting hours. Hannah always answered the same way. "I'm grateful to have work." Every coin she earned disappeared almost immediately. Rent, bread, firewood. Still, she somehow found enough kindness to remember every regular customer's favorite meal, to ask elderly travelers how their aching knees felt, to quietly leave warm soup beside those who admitted they could not afford dinner. People rarely remembered what Hannah looked like. They always remembered how she made them feel. One snowy afternoon, an unexpected procession arrived outside the tavern. Royal banners fluttered above polished black carriages. Castle guards entered first. Then came Lord Samuel Whitmore, the steward of Blackstone Castle. The tavern instantly fell silent. The owner hurried forward with a nervous bow. "My lord." Samuel smiled politely. "The royal kitchens require temporary assistance. Our annual winter council begins tomorrow. We need additional staff." Every waitress immediately straightened with excitement. Working inside the royal castle, even briefly, was considered an extraordinary honor. Samuel slowly looked around the room before his attention settled on Hannah. "You?" She blinked in surprise. "Me? I watched you serve this room for nearly an hour. You noticed who needed help before they asked. You never rushed anyone. You remembered every order without writing it down." Hannah lowered her eyes modestly. "I was only doing my job." Samuel nodded. "Sometimes. The people who say those words are exactly who we're looking for." The tavern owner smiled proudly. "You'd better pack your things." Hannah looked genuinely confused. "My things," Samuel answered calmly. "You'll leave for Blackstone Castle at sunrise." As the royal procession departed beneath the falling snow, Hannah stood quietly outside the tavern, holding the simple linen apron she had worn for years. She believed she had merely accepted temporary work serving meals inside a royal castle. She had no way of knowing that before the next winter ended, she would become the one person who saw hope where every healer, scholar, and noble had stopped looking 20 years before. Sometimes the smallest observation is dismissed because it comes from the quietest voice. Blackstone Castle was unlike anything Hannah Brooks had ever imagined. Towering stone walls stretched toward the gray winter sky. Royal banners fluttered above snow-covered courtyards. Dozens of servants hurried through endless hallways with practiced precision, each knowing exactly where they belonged. Hannah was certain she did not. She tightened her grip on the small canvas bag hanging from her shoulder as Lord Samuel Whitmore guided her through the grand entrance. "Stay close," he said kindly. "The castle has its own rhythm. You'll learn it." Hannah nodded. "I'll do my best." Samuel smiled faintly. "I believe you will." The royal kitchens were already overflowing with activity. Huge iron pots simmered over roaring fires. Fresh bread cooled across long wooden tables. Servants carried trays piled with roasted meats, vegetables, and warm pastries toward the banquet hall where the annual winter council would soon begin. The head cook, Mrs. Margaret Ellis, barely glanced up before pointing toward Hannah. "You're the new waitress?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She handed Hannah a polished silver tray. "The king's breakfast." Hannah accepted it carefully. Only then did she notice how differently the other servants reacted. Conversation stopped. Several cooks quietly stepped aside. One young maid whispered, "She doesn't know." Another servant gently shook his head. No one told her. Hannah looked between them. "Told me what?" Mrs. Ellis answered softly. "You'll understand soon enough." Moments later, Hannah followed an elderly footman through a series of silent corridors. Unlike the busy kitchens below, the upper levels of the castle felt almost sacred. No laughter, no hurried footsteps, only quiet. The footman stopped before a pair of carved oak doors. "Remember," he whispered, "His Majesty values honesty, but never pity." Hannah nodded slowly. "I understand." The doors opened. Sunlight poured through towering windows overlooking the snow-covered mountains beyond Blackstone Kingdom. Near the western window sat Alpha King Ethan Walker. His broad shoulders still carried the unmistakable presence of a warrior. Silver threads had begun appearing within his dark hair. His jaw remained strong. His piercing blue eyes still held the quiet authority that had united countless packs. Only the handcrafted oak wheelchair beneath him revealed the burden he had carried for 20 years. He wasn't reading. He wasn't speaking. He simply watched the distant forest beyond the castle walls, as though searching for something that no longer existed. The footman announced softly, "Your Majesty." "Breakfast." Without turning around, Ethan answered, "Leave it." His voice remained calm, controlled, almost emotionless. The footman stepped backward and quietly left the room. Hannah carefully carried the tray toward the small table beside the window. As she reached forward, one spoon slipped from the edge of the tray. The silver utensil struck the marble floor with a soft metallic sound. "I'm so sorry." She immediately knelt to retrieve it. As she bent down, her eyes instinctively followed the direction of the fallen spoon. For only a brief second, she noticed something no one else appeared to see. The toes beneath Ethan's heavy wool blanket had moved. Not much, barely enough to disturb the fabric. A tiny twitch, so small another person might have dismissed it as imagination. Hannah froze. She slowly looked back toward the Alpha King. His eyes remained fixed on the mountains. His expression never changed. Had he noticed? Or had the movement happened without his awareness? She quietly replaced the spoon with another from the serving tray. When she straightened, Ethan finally spoke. "You've been staring for quite a while." Hannah hesitated. For a moment she considered telling him what she had seen. Instead, she lowered her eyes. "I apologize, Your Majesty." He nodded once. "You may go." Hannah bowed respectfully before leaving the chamber. The heavy doors closed behind her. She continued walking through the corridor. Yet her thoughts remained inside that room. Every physician in the kingdom insisted the Alpha King had felt nothing below his waist for 20 years. But she had seen movement. Tiny, brief, almost impossible to notice. Still, she could not convince herself she had imagined it. Far behind the closed doors, Ethan remained beside the window exactly as before. Except now, for reasons he could not explain, he found himself thinking about the quiet waitress who had looked at him differently from every healer, noble, or servant who had entered that room during the past 2 decades. She had not looked at his wheelchair. She had looked at him. Neither of them realized that a single fallen spoon had just become the first step toward uncovering a truth buried beneath 20 years of hopelessness. The difference between giving up and healing is sometimes nothing more than one person asking a question everyone else stopped asking. For the next 3 days, Hannah Brooks carried breakfast, lunch, and supper to the Alpha King's private chambers. She spoke very little. So did Ethan Walker. Their conversations rarely lasted longer than a few words. "Good morning, Your Majesty." "Good morning. Would you like more tea?" "No, thank you. You should rest." "I've rested for 20 years." Every exchange ended there. Yet Hannah noticed something unusual. Not about his condition. About his routine. Every physician who visited Ethan focused on his legs. They tapped his knees, pressed his feet, measured muscle strength, asked whether he felt pain. No one seemed interested in everything surrounding those examinations. Hannah was. She noticed Ethan always requested the heavy chair beside the western window, never the eastern one. She noticed he unconsciously tightened his left hand whenever servants moved his wheelchair over the thick woven carpet. She noticed he often closed his eyes after long council meetings, not because he was tired, but because discomfort slowly spread across his lower back. Most importantly, she noticed breakfast. Every morning, shortly after finishing his meal, Ethan's breathing became noticeably shallower. His shoulders stiffened. The fingers resting upon the armrests curled slightly tighter. No one reacted. The servants quietly collected empty dishes. The royal healer simply assumed prolonged sitting caused discomfort. But Hannah wasn't convinced. Late that afternoon, while polishing silverware inside the kitchens, she quietly approached Mrs. Margaret Ellis. "May I ask something?" The older woman smiled. "You may. Does the king always become uncomfortable after breakfast?" Mrs. Ellis paused. "I suppose he does. I've seen it for years." "Has anyone asked why?" The head cook looked surprised. "The healer said it was part of his condition." Hannah nodded thoughtfully. "But what if it isn't?" Mrs. Ellis studied the young waitress for several moments. "You're thinking like someone who isn't supposed to." "I don't mean disrespect." "I know." The older woman answered gently. "But be careful. The royal healers don't appreciate questions from kitchen staff." That warning stayed with Hannah. Still, the questions refused to leave her mind. The following morning, she entered Ethan's chamber carrying breakfast once again. This time she carefully observed every detail. Fresh bread, roasted venison, herbal tea, dark berry preserves, a steaming bowl of thick root vegetable soup. As Ethan quietly ate, Hannah noticed something else. He never touched the soup. Not once. Instead, he finished everything else before gently pushing the bowl aside. "You don't like it?" she asked without thinking. Ethan looked mildly surprised. "No one has ever asked." She smiled apologetically. "I shouldn't have." He glanced toward the untouched bowl. "It isn't the taste." "What is it?" He hesitated. "I always feel worse afterward." Hannah's eyes widened slightly. "The soup." "I assumed so. For 20 years. Has anyone changed the recipe?" A faint smile appeared at the corner of Ethan's mouth. "The castle has employed 23 royal cooks. The recipe never changed. Because every healer insisted the soup helped strengthen the body." Silence settled between them. Hannah looked at the bowl, then back at Ethan. "Would you mind?" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry." He raised an eyebrow. "What?" She chose her words carefully. "Would you mind not drinking it tomorrow?" Ethan stared at her. "You think a bowl of soup explains 20 years of paralysis?" Hannah immediately shook her head. "No. I think 20 years is far too long to stop noticing small things." For the first time since she had arrived, the Alpha King laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long. But it was real. A quiet laugh filled with disbelief rather than amusement. "You speak differently from my healers. They speak about certainty. You speak about possibility." Hannah lowered her eyes. "I only notice what I see." After breakfast, she carried the untouched soup back toward the kitchens. Halfway through the corridor, she nearly collided with royal healer Gregory Hawthorne. The elderly physician glanced at the bowl. "The king didn't finish it again?" "No, sir." Gregory sighed. "He never does. Still, we prepare it every morning." Hannah looked up. "Why?" The healer answered almost automatically. "Because that's what the treatment requires." Then he continued walking. Hannah remained standing in the hallway. Treatment. Not habit. Not preference. Treatment. She slowly looked back toward the king's chamber. Every healer had spent 20 years trying to restore movement to Ethan's legs. But no one, not even once, had questioned whether part of the treatment itself might also be preventing the recovery they desperately sought. For the first time since entering Blackstone Castle, Hannah realized she was no longer simply serving meals. She was beginning to uncover a mystery that 20 years of unquestioned certainty had carefully hidden from everyone. People rarely reject an idea because it is impossible. They reject it because it comes from the wrong person. Hannah barely slept that night. The unanswered questions followed her long after the castle had fallen silent. Why had the same medicinal soup been served every morning for 20 years? Why had no one ever questioned whether it helped at all? And why had every healer accepted the answer without asking another question? By sunrise, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to accuse anyone. She simply wanted permission to perform the smallest experiment imaginable. One breakfast. Without the soup. Nothing more. As she entered the royal chamber carrying Ethan's morning meal, she noticed he was already awake. The Alpha King sat beside the familiar western window, reading reports from neighboring packs. Without looking up, he said softly, "You've been thinking." Hannah hesitated. Was it that obvious? A faint smile crossed his face. "You've worn the same expression since yesterday." She placed the breakfast tray on the table. The soup was missing. Ethan immediately noticed. "You forgot something." "I didn't." His blue eyes lifted toward her. "You removed it." "Yes." Silence settled between them. Finally, Hannah took a careful breath. "Your Majesty, I'd like to ask for your trust." He leaned back slightly. "For what purpose?" "I don't know whether I'm right. I only know I've observed something that troubles me, and I'd like to test one small change." Ethan studied her quietly. "You believe this concerns my treatment. I believe it deserves one morning." Before Ethan could answer, the chamber doors suddenly opened. Royal healer Gregory Hawthorne entered with two assistants carrying leather medical cases. His sharp eyes immediately found the breakfast tray, then the missing bowl. His expression darkened. "Where is the king's restorative broth?" Hannah answered honestly. "I chose not to serve it today." Gregory's voice became cold. "You chose. I wished to observe whether you wished." The elderly healer interrupted. A tense silence filled the room. Gregory slowly turned toward Ethan. "Your Majesty, this woman is a waitress. She has no medical training, no understanding of your condition, and yet she presumes to interfere with a treatment followed faithfully for 20 years. Hannah remained calm. "I am not claiming to cure anyone. I only asked whether one morning without the broth might tell us something." Gregory looked almost offended. "Tell us something? We have devoted our lives to His Majesty's care. Do you truly believe a tavern waitress has discovered what generations of royal physicians somehow overlooked?" The words echoed through the chamber. Several nearby servants quietly lowered their heads. No one dared speak. Ethan remained silent. Not because he agreed, because he was listening. Gregory continued, "Your Majesty, servants are hired to carry trays, not question physicians. If every maid begins altering medical treatment according to personal opinions, this castle will become chaos." Hannah felt dozens of eyes fixed upon her. Embarrassment warmed her face. Still, she refused to lower her voice. "I never said the physicians were wrong. I only said we may have stopped asking new questions." Gregory laughed quietly. "There are no new questions. There are only established facts. His Majesty's paralysis cannot be reversed. It has been proven repeatedly." Hannah looked toward Ethan. "For 20 years. Has anyone ever removed the broth?" Gregory answered immediately. "No. Because it is essential. Essential because it helps." Hannah asked gently, "Or essential because it has always been there?" The chamber became completely silent. For the first time, Gregory had no immediate answer. Only anger. "You've crossed your place." He stepped closer. "If you continue interfering with royal treatment, I will personally recommend your dismissal before sunset." Every servant expected Hannah to apologize. Instead, she bowed respectfully. "If protecting my position requires me to ignore something I sincerely question." She lifted her eyes. "Then perhaps I don't deserve the position." Those words surprised everyone, especially Ethan. For 20 years, countless physicians had defended their reputations. Countless nobles had defended their authority. But this young waitress, she wasn't defending herself. She was defending a question. After a long silence, Ethan slowly closed the report in his hands. His voice remained calm. "Dr. Hawthorne." The elderly healer immediately straightened. "Yes, Your Majesty. I have followed every instruction given to me for 20 years. "Yes. And nothing has changed." Gregory lowered his eyes. Regrettably, Ethan looked toward the untouched place where the soup normally rested, then toward Hannah. "One morning." Gregory blinked. "Your Majesty? We will try one morning. The healer's face lost all color. But sire, Ethan calmly raised one hand. I have spent 20 years following certainty. He looked directly at Hannah. Perhaps today, I can afford to spend one morning following possibility. A miracle does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it begins with a difference so small that only the patient notices. The first morning passed quietly. Without the restorative broth, breakfast ended much as it always had. Royal healer Gregory Hawthorne watched every movement with folded arms, clearly expecting Hannah's experiment to fail before noon. He examined Ethan's pulse, his breathing, his eyes, his hands. Everything appeared unchanged. When Gregory finally left the chamber, he paused beside Hannah. I hope you've learned something. She met his gaze respectfully. I have. He waited. One morning isn't enough. The healer scoffed before disappearing down the corridor. That afternoon, Ethan attended another lengthy council meeting. For years, these gatherings followed the same painful pattern. After an hour, his shoulders tightened. After 2 hours, his lower back became unbearable. By the end of every meeting, exhaustion covered his face long before anyone noticed. Today, something felt different. Not dramatic, not miraculous, simply lighter. As the council dismissed for the evening, Ethan remained seated in silence. Lord Samuel Whitmore approached cautiously. Your Majesty? Ethan slowly looked up. Did today's meeting feel shorter? Samuel blinked. It lasted exactly 3 hours. The Alpha King frowned thoughtfully. It didn't feel like 3. Samuel smiled politely. I'll consider that good news. That evening, Hannah quietly delivered supper. She immediately noticed something. Ethan's shoulders were resting naturally against the chair instead of leaning forward under invisible strain. His breathing remained steady. Most surprising of all, the deep lines of discomfort around his eyes had softened. She said nothing. Instead, she simply served the meal. After several quiet moments, Ethan finally spoke. I wasn't in as much pain today. Hannah looked up. You noticed? I've lived with it for 20 years. I notice every difference. He studied her carefully. You expected this. She shook her head. No, I hoped. There is a difference. Those aren't the same thing. For the first time in many years, Ethan found himself wondering about tomorrow. The following morning, Gregory insisted the restorative broth be returned. It has always been part of the treatment. The experiment is over. Before anyone else could respond, Ethan calmly spoke. No. The room fell silent. For another 3 days. Gregory stared at him. Your Majesty, there is no scientific basis. There wasn't one for continuing it either. Ethan interrupted quietly. We simply never questioned it. The healer's jaw tightened. As you wish. Over the next 3 days, subtle changes continued. The stiffness after breakfast disappeared completely. Ethan slept longer through the night. His headaches became less frequent. His appetite slowly returned. None of these changes restored movement to his legs, but they restored something almost as important. Comfort, hope, curiosity. Castle servants began whispering in the corridors. The king smiled today. He finished an entire council meeting. He asked for another walk through the gardens. No one mentioned Hannah openly, but everyone noticed where these changes had begun. On the 4th morning, Ethan asked an unexpected question. Hannah. Yes, Your Majesty. When I dropped the spoon. She looked surprised. You noticed that? I noticed you looking beneath the blanket. A brief silence followed. I saw something. She admitted softly. What? I thought. She hesitated. I thought your toes moved. Instead of laughing, Ethan became very still. So did I. Those 3 words echoed through the quiet chamber. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Ethan continued. I convinced myself I imagined it. I've done that many times over 20 years. Hannah slowly knelt beside the wheelchair. May I? He nodded. Very gently, she lifted the edge of the heavy wool blanket. She didn't touch his legs. She simply observed. The muscles had not wasted away as completely as she expected. The left foot appeared slightly more responsive than the right. Tiny details, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore once seen. Footsteps suddenly echoed outside. Gregory entered without warning. His expression hardened the instant he saw Hannah kneeling beside the king's chair. What exactly are you doing? Hannah stood immediately, observing. The healer's eyes narrowed. You are beginning to mistake curiosity for qualification. Ethan looked directly at Gregory. No. His calm voice filled the room. She's beginning to notice things everyone else overlooked. For the first time in 20 years, the certainty surrounding the Alpha King's condition had begun to crack. And standing inside that widening crack was not a famous physician, but a quiet waitress who refused to stop paying attention. The truth becomes dangerous the moment evidence begins replacing assumptions. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere inside Blackstone Castle had quietly changed. No one announced it. No one admitted it aloud. Yet every servant noticed the same impossible detail. The Alpha King looked healthier. His complexion had regained a faint color. The shadows beneath his eyes had begun to fade. He no longer ended every afternoon fighting exhaustion. Even the guards stationed outside his private chambers whispered among themselves. He's speaking longer during council. He stayed in the library until sunset yesterday. I haven't seen him that alert in years. Hannah ignored the rumors. She continued serving meals exactly as before. Simple, quiet, observant. She knew better than to mistake improvement for recovery. One morning, Ethan surprised her. Hannah. Yes, Your Majesty. I'd like you to accompany me. She looked confused. Where? The rehabilitation hall. For 20 years, Ethan had followed the same routine. Stretching, massage, exercises supervised by the royal healers. Every session ended exactly the same way. Nothing changed. As they entered the spacious training hall, Gregory Hawthorne was already waiting with several assistants. His expression hardened the moment he noticed Hannah beside the king. Your Majesty, I wasn't informed she would attend. Ethan calmly replied, I invited her. Gregory forced a polite smile. As you wish. The session began. Two attendants carefully helped Ethan transfer onto a padded treatment table. Gregory tested familiar reflexes. The right leg. Nothing. The left leg. Nothing obvious. He prepared to end the examination as usual. Then Hannah quietly spoke. May I ask one question? Gregory sighed. You seem to ask many. She remained respectful. Would you repeat the test more slowly? The healer frowned. There is no reason. I think there is. Gregory looked toward Ethan. The Alpha King nodded once. Proceed. Clearly irritated, Gregory repeated the examination. This time, slower. He gently pressed against the sole of Ethan's left foot. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then, the smallest movement. One toe flexed. Barely. Almost invisible. One assistant gasped. Another leaned forward. Gregory immediately repeated the test. Again, the same tiny response. The room fell completely silent. No one spoke. No one breathed. After several long seconds, Gregory finally whispered, again. The test was repeated a third time. Another faint movement. Unmistakable. Not imagination. Not coincidence. Actual voluntary response. Ethan stared at his own foot as though it belonged to someone else. His voice barely emerged. I felt something. Every eye turned toward him. Gregory's expression changed for the first time since Hannah arrived at the castle. Confidence disappeared. Disbelief replaced it. What did you feel? A pressure. Very faint. But Ethan swallowed. I felt it. The assistants exchanged stunned glances. One quietly crossed himself. Another covered his mouth. 20 years. Not one confirmed sensation. Until today, Gregory immediately stepped forward. It could be temporary. It could be involuntary muscle activity. It proves nothing. Hannah remained silent. She understood his reaction. A lifetime of certainty had just been challenged by evidence. Gregory repeated every neurological examination he knew. Some produced nothing. Others revealed subtle responses never recorded before. Tiny, inconsistent, yet undeniably different from every report written during the previous 2 decades. That afternoon, Gregory locked himself inside the royal archives. Boxes of medical journals surrounded his desk. Hundreds of treatment records covered the table. He searched every page documenting Ethan's condition, hour after hour. Then, one detail caught his attention. The restorative broth. Every daily treatment record listed it. Every dosage. Every ingredient. Every adjustment. Except, one ingredient had quietly changed 18 years earlier. Not by Gregory. By his predecessor. A rare mountain herb called silverthorn root had replaced another medicinal plant after a supplier shortage. Gregory frowned. He quickly searched older medical texts. His heartbeat slowly increased. One faded manuscript contained a warning. Silverthorn root relieved chronic pain. but prolonged use could gradually suppress nerve sensitivity in certain patients. The physician stared at the page in stunned silence. Could 20 years of accepted treatment have unintentionally delayed the very recovery everyone had been trying to achieve? At that exact moment, Hannah stood alone in the castle gardens, watching the evening sun disappear beyond the snowy mountains. She had never claimed to possess secret knowledge. She had never promised a miracle. She had only asked one simple question that no one else had asked. Behind her, hurried footsteps echoed across the stone path. Lord Samuel approached, visibly out of breath. "Hannah." She turned. "The royal healer wants to see you." She immediately sensed something had changed. Not because someone had finally agreed with her, but because the evidence had begun speaking louder than anyone's pride ever could. The hardest words for an expert to say are not "I was wrong." They are "I never thought to look there." Hannah entered the royal healer's private study expecting another lecture. Instead, she found Gregory Hawthorne standing beside a desk covered with ancient medical journals, faded treatment records, and handwritten notes gathered over 2 decades. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Without lifting his eyes from the documents, he spoke first. "Close the door." She obeyed quietly. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Gregory picked up a weathered manuscript. "I found this last night." He carefully placed it in front of her. "I should have found it years ago." Hannah looked down. She couldn't read every ancient symbol, but one phrase had been translated into the common language. Extended exposure to silverthorn root may gradually suppress nerve response in rare patients. She slowly looked up. "The broth." Gregory nodded. "The broth." His voice was barely above a whisper. "It was changed 18 years ago. My predecessor replaced one ingredient during a supply shortage. I never questioned it." "You trusted the records." Hannah answered gently. "I trusted the physicians before me." Gregory corrected himself. "There's a difference." He leaned heavily against the desk. "A physician should trust evidence, not tradition." For the first time since they had met, Hannah saw no pride in the old healer, only regret. "I owe you an apology." She immediately shook her head. "No, I challenged your work. You challenged my assumptions." Gregory replied. "And you were brave enough to do it without humiliating me." A knock interrupted them. Lord Samuel entered hurriedly. "Your Majesty requests both of you." Minutes later, they entered the king's private chamber. Ethan looked from Gregory to Hannah. "I assume you found something." Gregory bowed his head. "I believe we have." For the next half hour, he explained everything. The ingredient replacement, the forgotten manuscript, the possible neurological effects, the small improvements following the broth's removal. When he finished, silence filled the room. Ethan remained thoughtful. "You believe the broth caused my paralysis?" Gregory answered immediately. "No. I believe it may have prevented your body from recovering as much as it otherwise could have. The original injury was real, but our treatment," he struggled to finish the sentence, "may have prolonged part of your suffering." No one spoke. The weight of 20 years settled heavily over the chamber. Finally, Ethan looked toward Hannah. "You never accused anyone." She lowered her eyes. "There was nothing to accuse. I only wanted to understand." Ethan smiled faintly. "That may be the reason we finally do." News of the king's improving condition spread quickly throughout the castle. Within days, nobles began arriving from neighboring territories. Some came offering congratulations. Others came searching for answers. Not everyone welcomed the change. Several respected physicians quietly questioned Gregory's conclusions. One even declared, "This is coincidence." Another insisted, "The waitress has manipulated everyone's expectations." Hannah heard every rumor. She answered none of them. Instead, she continued serving meals, helping Ethan during rehabilitation, recording every small improvement exactly as Gregory instructed. Each observation was carefully documented. No exaggeration, no false hope, only facts. A stronger grip, longer periods without pain, slightly improved sensation in the left foot. Nothing miraculous, everything measurable. One evening, Gregory joined Hannah in the castle gardens. "I've rewritten the treatment plan." She smiled. "That's wonderful." "No." He looked toward the fading sunset. "Wonderful would have been writing it 20 years ago." He handed her a neatly folded document. At the bottom of the first page appeared a sentence written in his own hand. "Observation submitted by Hannah Brooks." The young waitress looked at him in surprise. You included my name. I included the truth. Gregory answered. If future healers learn from this, they deserve to know who first noticed what all of us failed to see. Hannah carefully folded the paper. She had never wanted recognition. She had only wanted the king to have a chance no one else believed still existed. Far above them, inside the western tower, Ethan watched through the open window. For the first time in 20 years, he no longer felt surrounded by people trying to convince him to accept his fate. Instead, he was surrounded by people finally willing to question it. And sometimes, that was the first true step toward healing. Hope is fragile. The moment people begin believing again, someone will always try to convince them they were foolish. The weeks that followed transformed Blackstone Castle in ways no one had expected. Not because the Alpha King suddenly stood from his chair. He did not. Not because a miracle erased 20 years overnight. It did not. The change was quieter, steadier. Every morning, Ethan completed his rehabilitation with renewed determination. Every afternoon, Gregory documented another measurable improvement. Sensation in the left foot became more consistent. The constant pain that had haunted every waking hour continued to fade. His upper body grew stronger from longer therapy sessions. Most remarkable of all, the hopelessness that had filled his eyes for 2 decades slowly disappeared. For the first time, recovery was no longer an impossible dream. It had become a possibility. Yet possibility invited opposition. One morning, the Grand Medical Council arrived at Blackstone Castle. 6 of the most respected physicians from neighboring kingdoms entered the royal conference hall, wearing ceremonial robes that reflected decades of authority. They had not come to celebrate. They had come to investigate. Gregory stood beside Ethan throughout the meeting. Hannah remained quietly near the rear wall, prepared only to serve refreshments if requested. She expected no attention. She preferred it that way. The council chairman, Dr. Victor Aldrich, spoke first. We have reviewed your recent medical reports. Gregory nodded. They are accurate. Dr. Aldrich folded his hands. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They do. Gregory agreed without hesitation, which is why every observation has been documented. The chairman turned another page. These notes repeatedly reference. He paused. A waitress. Several physicians exchanged skeptical glances. Dr. Aldridge looked directly toward Hannah. You are Hannah Brooks? Yes, sir. You possess formal medical training? No. Have you studied at any academy? No. Were you ever licensed as a healer? No. A faint smile appeared on several faces around the table. The chairman closed the report. Then your conclusions cannot be considered scientific. Before Hannah could respond, Gregory calmly interrupted. They are not her conclusions. The room became quiet. They are her observations. There is an important difference. Dr. Aldrich frowned. Observation without expertise invites misunderstanding. Gregory slowly walked toward the center of the room. For 20 years, he looked around the chamber. We possessed expertise, and yet we overlooked what she observed within days. No one answered. Gregory continued. I spent my entire career believing experience alone guaranteed accuracy. I was mistaken. The greatest danger to medicine is not ignorance. It is certainty. Those words echoed through the conference hall. Even Ethan watched the elderly healer with quiet admiration. Dr. Aldrich finally spoke again. Are you suggesting this young woman deserves equal standing with trained physicians? Gregory shook his head. No. I'm suggesting wisdom is not determined by rank. It is determined by whether someone is willing to see what everyone else ignores. Silence followed. Then Ethan spoke for the first time. My physicians gave me 20 years of loyal service. I will never question their dedication. He turned toward Hannah. But dedication alone did not change my future. Curiosity did. Every eye followed his gaze. Hannah immediately lowered hers, uncomfortable with so much attention. She had never wanted to stand before nobles. She had only wanted the king to suffer less. After several more hours, the council completed its review. Its final recommendation surprised nearly everyone. The revised treatment would remain in effect. Further observation would continue under Gregory's supervision, and every recorded contribution, including Hannah's original observations, would become part of the official Royal Medical Archive. As the meeting ended, the physicians quietly departed. Some remained doubtful, others thoughtful. A few approached Gregory privately to request copies of the ancient manuscript. Questions had begun replacing certainty. That evening, Ethan wheeled himself onto the castle balcony overlooking the valley. Hannah brought him a warm cup of tea before turning to leave. Stay. She paused. He looked across the mountains glowing beneath the setting sun. When you first arrived, I thought you were simply kind. He smiled softly. Now I realize kindness was never your greatest strength. She looked at him with quiet curiosity. What was? Ethan's answer came without hesitation. You refused to stop asking why. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Far below, the castle lights slowly flickered to life. And somewhere beyond those walls, word was already spreading across every neighboring kingdom. Not that the Alpha King had been cured, but that one ordinary waitress had reminded an entire generation of healers that progress begins the moment someone dares to question what everyone else accepts. A kingdom does not change the day its king stands. It changes the day its people begin believing that hope deserves another chance. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. Snow disappeared from the castle walls. Fresh green leaves returned to the ancient oaks surrounding Blackstone Castle. For the first time in 20 years, the Royal Rehabilitation Hall no longer felt like a place built to preserve disappointment. It had become a place where progress quietly accumulated. Every morning, Ethan Walker trained before sunrise. Gregory carefully adjusted each exercise according to the latest observations. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was exaggerated. Every improvement was earned. One additional movement. One stronger muscle contraction. One longer period of balance supported by parallel wooden rails. Hannah remained exactly where she had always been. Not in the center of the room. Not giving instructions. Simply observing. Encouraging. Recording small details others might overlook. If Ethan's breathing became uneven, she noticed. If one exercise caused unnecessary strain, she quietly mentioned it to Gregory. If a tiny improvement appeared, she celebrated it no more than necessary. Hope, she had learned, grew strongest when it was allowed to grow naturally. Months earlier, Ethan had measured progress by impossible expectations. Now he measured it differently. Today I stood 5 seconds longer. Today I felt pressure beneath both feet. Today I needed less assistance than yesterday. Each victory remained small. Together, they became extraordinary. Word spread far beyond Blackstone Kingdom. Not that an Alpha King had been miraculously healed, but that an entire royal court had discovered the courage to question 20 years of unquestioned certainty. Young healers began requesting copies of Gregory's revised treatment journals. Medical academies invited discussions about observation, humility, and evidence. For the first time in generations, Hannah's simple habit of paying attention had begun changing how others approached healing itself. Then came the spring assembly. Representatives from every allied pact gathered inside the Great Hall. The event had originally been scheduled to celebrate another successful season of peace. Instead, everyone whispered about something else. Would the rumors prove true? Would the Alpha King appear? The massive oak doors slowly opened. The entire hall stood. Ethan entered wearing his ceremonial royal cloak. His wheelchair rolled forward as always. Nothing unusual. Nothing unexpected. Gregory walked beside him. Lord Samuel followed several steps behind. Hannah remained near one of the stone pillars, hoping to disappear among the servants. The assembly began. Reports were presented. Treaties were renewed. Harvest plans were discussed. Finally, Ethan slowly rose from his chair. The hall instantly fell silent. No one moved. No one breathed. With both hands resting firmly upon a polished wooden support rail prepared beside the throne, Ethan carefully shifted his weight. His legs trembled. Years of weakness resisted every movement. Gregory instinctively stepped forward. Ethan gently raised one hand. No. His voice remained calm. I'll do this. The hall became completely still. One careful breath. Another. His knees shook. His shoulders remained steady. Then, for the first time in 20 years, the Alpha King stood without anyone lifting him. Only for a few seconds. Only with support. But he stood. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Several nobles wiped tears from their eyes. Old soldiers who had once fought beside Ethan quietly lowered their heads. Gregory closed his eyes for a brief moment, overwhelmed by emotions he could no longer hide. Hannah did not cheer. She simply smiled through tears she had never intended anyone to see. After a long moment, Ethan slowly sat again. Thunderous applause filled the great hall. Yet he gently lifted one hand. The room immediately fell silent once more. There are people who believe today is about a king standing. He looked across the assembled packs. They are mistaken. His gaze slowly found Hannah. 24-year-old Hannah Brooks immediately looked down, uncomfortable with hundreds of eyes turning toward her. Ethan continued, 20 years ago, I accepted that my future had already been written. So did my physicians. So did my court. So did I. He paused. Then a young waitress entered this castle carrying nothing except kindness and the courage to ask one simple question. He smiled warmly. Not because she believed she knew more, but because she believed no one should stop looking. Gregory stepped forward. In every official record written from this day forward, the first observation that changed His Majesty's treatment will forever bear the name Hannah Brooks. The hall erupted into applause once again. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Gregory smiled gently. No, you earned it. Ethan extended his hand toward her. She hesitated before walking across the great hall. Every noble watched in respectful silence. Every servant smiled proudly. When she reached him, Ethan spoke softly enough that only those nearest could hear. You gave me something no physician could prescribe. Hannah looked at him. What was that, Your Majesty? He smiled. The courage to believe my story wasn't finished. Outside, church bells echoed across the valley as spring sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of Blackstone Castle. The Alpha King had not fully recovered. His journey was far from over. But neither he nor his kingdom feared that truth anymore, because everyone had finally learned the lesson one ordinary waitress had quietly brought through the castle gates. Sometimes the greatest healing begins not with extraordinary power, but with an ordinary person who refuses to stop caring when everyone else has already accepted defeat. The greatest victories are not measured by how far someone walks, but by how many lives they inspire to keep moving. The weeks following the spring assembly changed Blackstone Kingdom more profoundly than anyone had imagined. Not because the Alpha King had stood before the nobles. Everyone had already heard that story. The real change happened afterward. People stopped speaking about miracles. They started speaking about effort. Every morning before sunrise, villagers gathered outside the castle walls hoping to witness Ethan's rehabilitation. No one was allowed inside the training hall. Still, seeing the lights appear before dawn reminded them that their king had not stopped fighting. Children who once believed weakness meant defeat now played games pretending to help one another stand. Young apprentices at the Royal Academy copied Gregory's revised treatment journals instead of memorizing old assumptions without question. Servants who had spent years believing their opinions carried no value began paying closer attention to the small details others overlooked. One ordinary observation had quietly transformed an entire culture. Gregory noticed it first. One afternoon, he entered the rehabilitation hall carrying a thick stack of letters. They're from every corner of the kingdom. Ethan smiled. More congratulations? Gregory shook his head. No, they're questions. He handed several letters to Hannah. One came from a village healer asking how to improve his observation skills. Another was written by a stable boy who had discovered an illness in one of the royal horses because he remembered Hannah's example. A third came from a widow caring for her elderly father. She wrote that she had almost accepted his worsening condition until she remembered the story of the king. She decided to seek another opinion. The new physician discovered a treatable infection. Her father survived. Hannah quietly folded the letters. I never imagined. Gregory smiled. Neither did I. Ethan looked toward the castle window overlooking the valley. You didn't simply change my treatment. You changed the way people think. That realization humbled Hannah more than any public recognition ever could. Several days later, the royal council gathered once again. This meeting was different. No political negotiations. No military reports. Instead, Ethan presented a proposal. I want a new institution established. The council listened carefully. A place where healers, scholars, craftsmen, servants, and ordinary citizens may exchange observations freely. Several nobles exchanged uncertain glances. One elder cautiously asked, without regard for social rank. Exactly, Ethan answered. If truth only belongs to titles, then we will continue overlooking it. The proposal passed unanimously. Construction of the House of Observation began before the month ended. Its guiding principle was carved above the entrance in stone. Every voice deserves to be heard. Gregory personally requested a second inscription beneath it, inspired by the courage of Hannah Brooks. When Hannah discovered the inscription, she immediately protested. "My name doesn't belong there." Gregory smiled warmly. "It isn't there to honor you." She looked confused. "It's there to remind everyone after we're gone that wisdom can arrive wearing an apron instead of a crown." Months continued passing. Ethan's recovery advanced slowly. Some days brought progress. Others brought frustration. Yet something important had disappeared forever: despair. Whenever difficult days arrived, no one interpreted them as failure. They simply became another step in a longer journey. One quiet evening, Hannah found Ethan sitting alone in the castle gardens. He had dismissed his attendants. The sun painted golden light across the lake below the cliffs. "You look thoughtful," she said. "I was remembering the day you first served me soup." Ethan replied with a faint smile. "You barely looked at me." "I was afraid," she admitted. "Of the Alpha King?" he asked. She laughed softly. "No, I was afraid I might be wrong." Ethan considered her answer for a long moment. "And yet, you spoke anyway." She nodded. "I couldn't ignore what I believed was true." Ethan looked across the peaceful valley. "I've spent years wondering why every healer failed. Now I realize they didn't fail because they lacked knowledge. They failed because no one challenged certainty." He turned toward Hannah. "You reminded all of us that courage doesn't always look like a warrior drawing a sword. Sometimes, it looks like a quiet waitress asking one more question." The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming wildflowers through the gardens. Neither of them noticed how naturally silence had become comfortable between them. There was no need for grand speeches anymore. The greatest transformation had already taken place, not only inside the Alpha King's body, but inside the hearts of everyone who had learned that compassion, humility, and curiosity could accomplish what pride alone never could. And Blackstone Kingdom would remember that lesson for generations to come. The true measure of a legacy is not how many people remember your name, but how many lives become better because of what you taught them. A year passed. The seasons completed their quiet circle around Blackstone Castle. Spring flowers gave way to summer sunlight. Summer surrendered to golden autumn. Autumn welcomed another peaceful winter. Throughout the kingdom, life continued as it always had. Markets opened before sunrise. Children laughed through narrow village streets. Farmers prepared new harvests. Yet beneath those ordinary routines, something extraordinary had taken root. The House of Observation had become the busiest building in Blackstone. It was unlike any academy ever built. Inside its stone walls, seasoned physicians studied beside young apprentices. Castle servants shared observations with scholars. Stable hands described animal illnesses to experienced healers. Kitchen workers discussed herbs with botanists. No voice was dismissed simply because of social rank. Every idea was examined. Every observation was tested. Evidence replaced assumption. Humility replaced pride. Gregory often smiled as he walked through its halls. Years ago, such conversations would have been impossible. Now they had become ordinary. And ordinary, he realized, was exactly how lasting change begins. One cold morning, Hannah arrived carrying a basket of fresh bread for the students. She paused outside the entrance. Above the doorway, the stone inscription remained untouched. Every voice deserves to be heard. She still felt embarrassed whenever visitors recognized her name beneath it. To her, the words mattered far more than the person they honored. Inside the lecture hall, Gregory invited her to remain. "We're discussing clinical observation today." She quietly shook her head. "I don't belong in front of a classroom." Gregory smiled knowingly. "That's exactly why you do." Moments later, nearly 50 students filled the room. Some expected a formal lecture. Others anticipated complicated medical theories. Instead, Gregory simply asked Hannah one question. "What was the first thing you noticed when you served the king?" She thought for a moment. "He stopped smelling the soup before drinking it." The students looked puzzled. Gregory remained silent. Hannah continued. "I thought that was unusual, so I kept watching." Another student raised a hand. "Why didn't everyone else notice?" Hannah answered honestly. "Maybe they were looking for something bigger." The room became quiet. Gregory turned toward the class. "Remember that. The greatest discoveries often begin with the smallest details." No one wrote those words because they sounded dramatic. They wrote them because everyone in the room knew they were true. That afternoon, Ethan visited the academy unexpectedly. He no longer required his wheelchair every hour of the day. For short distances, supported by a carved walking cane, he could move carefully through the castle. Each step remained slow. Each movement required concentration. But each step belonged entirely to him. The students immediately stood. Ethan smiled. "Please, sit." He looked around the hall. "A year ago, I believed my greatest responsibility was ruling this kingdom." He glanced toward Hannah. "I was wrong. My greatest responsibility was learning." He paused before continuing. "A king who stops learning eventually asks his people to stop learning too." The students listened without making a sound. "I hope none of you ever become so respected that you stop asking questions." When the gathering ended, Hannah walked beside Ethan through the snowy courtyard. The afternoon sun reflected across the frozen lake. "I never imagined any of this," she admitted quietly. "Neither did I," Ethan replied. "I thought healing meant returning to the person I used to be." He stopped walking for a moment. "Now I understand. Healing isn't becoming who we were. It's becoming someone wiser because of what we've endured." Hannah smiled gently. The words felt true for both of them. She was no longer the invisible waitress who believed her place was simply to serve meals. And Ethan was no longer the king who believed strength existed only in perfect health. Together, without ever planning to, they had reshaped not only one life, but an entire kingdom's understanding of compassion, courage, and hope. The snow continued falling softly across Blackstone Castle. No celebration marked the anniversary. No grand ceremony filled the halls. None was needed, because the greatest transformations rarely announced themselves with trumpets. They revealed themselves quietly. One careful observation, one courageous question, and one act of kindness at a time. Some stories end with a miracle. The most meaningful ones begin after the miracle becomes everyday life. 5 years passed. No one in Blackstone Kingdom counted them by calendars anymore. They counted them by lives changed. 5 years since a quiet waitress had carried a simple bowl of soup into the royal chamber. 5 years since she had noticed what generations of experts had overlooked. 5 years since one ordinary question had quietly rewritten the future of an entire kingdom. Blackstone itself had become almost unrecognizable. Not because grand castles had been rebuilt. Not because wealth had suddenly appeared. The greatest transformation could not be measured with gold. It could only be seen in people. The House of Observation had expanded far beyond its original walls. Students traveled from neighboring kingdoms to study there. Young physicians worked beside experienced craftsmen. Midwives exchanged ideas with botanists. Stable masters taught anatomy through years of caring for injured horses. Even cooks shared knowledge about herbs and nutrition. No profession was considered too humble to contribute. Every lesson began with the same principle. Observe first. Assume last. Question always. Gregory had officially retired from royal service. His white hair had become even thinner, his steps slower. Yet every morning he still walked through the academy gardens carrying a worn leather notebook. Students often gathered around him, expecting complicated lectures. Instead, he usually asked simple questions. What changed today? What did you notice? What surprised you? Those questions produced better healers than any textbook ever had. Hannah continued living inside the castle. Very little about her routine had changed. She still preferred serving breakfast herself. She still greeted every servant by name. She still visited recovering patients inside the royal infirmary each afternoon. Visitors often expected someone celebrated throughout the kingdoms to behave differently. Instead, they found the same gentle young woman who quietly listened more than she spoke. Her greatest achievement had never been discovering a treatment. It had been refusing to believe that anyone deserved to suffer without being truly seen. Ethan's recovery had also continued. Slowly, patiently, faithfully. He still relied upon a carved cane during long walks. Some difficult days reminded him of the years he had lost. Pain occasionally returned after exhausting journeys. He accepted those moments without bitterness. Because healing, he now understood, was never a straight path. One spring afternoon, he walked through the academy courtyard without attendants. Children stopped their lessons to greet him. He smiled at each one. Near the fountain, he noticed a young apprentice kneeling beside an elderly gardener whose hands trembled while planting flowers. The boy carefully supported the man's wrist before asking, "Does this hurt more when you bend your fingers or when you grip the shovel? Ethan quietly watched from a distance. The question sounded familiar, not because of its words, because of its spirit. The apprentice had not begun with certainty. He had begun with curiosity. Later that evening, Ethan found Hannah arranging fresh flowers inside the castle chapel. "The kingdom keeps changing," he said softly. She smiled. "It always will." He looked toward the stained glass windows glowing with the colors of sunset. "I used to believe leaders changed history. And now?" she asked. "I think ordinary people do." She laughed quietly. "Then why do we need kings?" Ethan smiled. "To make sure ordinary people are finally heard." For a long moment, they stood together in peaceful silence. Neither needed recognition anymore. Neither sought praise. The work itself had become enough. Outside, a carriage arrived carrying another group of students from distant lands. They had traveled hundreds of miles because they wished to learn the philosophy that had transformed Blackstone. Not a secret medicine, not a magical cure, a different way of seeing. Gregory watched the newcomers from the castle balcony, his tired eyes filled with quiet satisfaction. Years earlier, he had feared his greatest legacy would be the mistakes he had made. Instead, his greatest legacy became admitting those mistakes before it was too late. As darkness settled across the valley, lanterns illuminated every pathway leading toward the house of observation. From above, they looked like countless tiny stars scattered across the earth. Each light represented another person searching for answers instead of accepting assumptions. Another person willing to listen before speaking. Another person courageous enough to ask one more question. And somewhere among those lights, almost unnoticed as always, Hannah continued walking with the same quiet kindness that had changed one man's life. Without ever seeking greatness, she had inspired thousands to become a little more compassionate, a little more curious, and a little more hopeful than they had been the day before. That, more than any miracle, became the true healing of Blackstone Kingdom. Long after people forget the details of a miracle, they remember how someone made them feel, and that is how hope survives. Many years later, travelers still crossed mountains and rivers to visit Blackstone Kingdom. Some came because they had heard the story of the Alpha King who had slowly learned to walk again. Others came searching for the famous house of observation, where knowledge belonged to everyone, regardless of birth or title. Most arrived expecting to discover a legendary secret. They always left with something much simpler. The understanding that extraordinary change often begins with ordinary kindness. Children born after Ethan's recovery grew up believing it had always been normal for servants, healers, scholars, soldiers, and rulers to learn from one another. To them, it sounded strange that there had once been a time when social rank decided whose voice mattered. The old ways slowly became stories. The new way became tradition. One quiet autumn afternoon, an elderly couple arrived at the castle gates holding the hands of a little girl. She had been unable to walk confidently since birth. Her parents had traveled for weeks, hoping someone at Blackstone might help. The royal physicians examined the child carefully. They made no impossible promises. Instead, they listened. They observed. They asked questions. Several apprentices worked together with experienced healers. The girl's parents were invited to describe every small detail they had noticed over the years. Nothing was dismissed. Nothing was considered unimportant. Standing quietly at the back of the room, Hannah watched with gentle satisfaction. No one realized they were following the example she had set years before. They simply believed this was how healing should be done. Later that evening, Ethan joined her on the castle terrace overlooking the valley. The lights of the academy shimmered beneath the stars. Hundreds of students still filled its halls every season. "It's beautiful," Ethan said softly. Hannah nodded. "It belongs to all of them now." He smiled. "I used to think kingdoms were remembered for their victories. And now?" she asked. "I think they're remembered for what they teach." A peaceful silence settled between them. Neither of them had become legends because they had sought greatness. One had chosen to keep asking questions. The other had chosen to keep listening. Together, they had shown that true leadership was never about standing above others. It was about lifting others high enough to be heard. As the evening breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves across the castle gardens, Gregory slowly approached with the help of his walking stick. Age had finally caught him, yet the warmth in his eyes remained unchanged. "I have one last request," he said with a quiet smile. The following morning, students, Villagers, servants, nobles, and visitors gathered in the central courtyard. Gregory unveiled a simple stone monument. There were no statues of kings, no portraits of famous healers, only a few carefully carved words. The smallest observation can change the greatest life. The quietest voice deserves to be heard. The kindest heart may heal what knowledge alone cannot. No author's name appeared beneath the inscription. Gregory insisted it belonged to everyone. Years later, children would stop before that stone and ask their parents what the words meant. Each family told the story a little differently. Some spoke about an alpha king who refused to surrender. Some remembered an old physician humble enough to admit he had been wrong. Most smiled as they described a young waitress carrying a bowl of soup, quietly noticing what everyone else had overlooked. The details changed with every generation. The lesson never did. And so the story of Blackstone Kingdom endured, not as a tale of magic, destiny, or impossible miracles, but as a reminder that compassion, curiosity, humility, and courage possess a power greater than pride. Because sometimes the person who changes a kingdom forever does not wear a crown, carry a sword, or command an army. Sometimes she simply carries a tray, asks one more question, and refuses to stop caring. That is how one waitress transformed the life of an alpha king. That is how one act of kindness transformed an entire kingdom. And that is why, long after every castle stone has weathered and every generation has passed, hope will always begin with someone willing to notice what everyone else has forgotten to see.